Hello and welcome to the channel. So in today's video we'll be going over why you should shoot in a higher frame rate like 50 frames per second, around 60 frames per second or higher. So let's get into it. So one of the big reasons why you would record in a higher frame rate than normal would be for the purpose of slow motion. Now if you say are recording in 30 frames per second, oftentimes you play it back in 30 frames per second, same with like recording in 25, playing it back in 25 and so on and so forth. However, what if you want to slow that down over like say 2 or more seconds? So if you were to take 30 frames per second and stretch it out over 2 seconds, then you would have 15 frames per second. And so you could end up with kind of choppy or jumpy looking video. It might not look all that good. However, if you were to record in 60 frames per second and stretch that over 2 seconds, then you would end up with 30 frames per second, and so it should look a lot smoother. So you could also do a similar thing if you recorded in 50 frames per second and played it back in 25 frames per second. You could play it back at half speed to get that smoother looking frame rate. You could also record in 60 frames per second and slow it down to 40% of the original speed, in which case you'd have 24 frames per second. The higher the frame rate that you record in, the more you can slow it down without it looking like choppy. Another reason that you might record in a higher frame rate like 50 or around 60 frames per second is you might like the look of footage at that particular playback speed. So I've noticed on some like ASMR videos and I think some gaming videos also, they have playback speeds of around 50-60 frames per second, and so you and the audience may just like the way that the playback speed looks at that higher frame rate. For example, right now I'm actually recording around 60 frames per second, so it kind of has like that a different smoothness to it. So if you're ever watching a YouTube video and it looks almost unnaturally smooth, you might look, if you go to settings and for the resolution, it might say something like 1080-60, 1440-60, or 2160-60. I think I got the number right for 4K. Anyway, if it says like the resolution and then 60 after it or 50, it's playing back at a high frame rate. Now you can record at even higher frame rates like 120 frames per second, 240 frames per second, and I think there are some cameras that even go faster than that, but I don't even think YouTube supports higher than 60 frames per second playback. Now the frame rate that you record in will probably have something to do with what setting your camera is set to. So there are two big standards that a lot of cameras support, and those are NTSC, which is what we use here in the US, and there's also PAL, which I think they use in places in Europe and I think also South America. NTSC has frame rates like around 24 frames per second, around 30 frames per second, around 60 frames per second, and around 120 frames per second, I think. Anyway, I say around because it's not actually the full frame rate. Way back when, I think in the early days of color TVs, they had problems with the equipment. They ended up slowing down the frame rates 0.1%. So instead of 24 frames per second, it's actually 23.9 something. Instead of 30, it's actually 29.9 something, so on and so forth. Now, PAL standard, they have frame rates like 25, 50, and 100 frames per second, and unlike NTSC, these are the actual frame rates. It's not around 25, it is 25 frames per second. So, which should you shoot in, PAL standards or NTSC? Well, unless you're doing work for like an industry or a client who wants a specific frame rate, it's largely subjective and you can pretty much pick whichever one you want to film in. So I hope you find this helpful. I thank you for watching this video. If you liked it or it brought you value, I ask that you hit the like button. I'd really appreciate it. And bye.